Welcome to History Teller YT. Today, we are stepping into one of the most powerful and haunting stories ever told by human civilization. This is not just the story of a city. This is the story of how humanity first learned to rule, to write laws, to measure time, to build empires, and eventually, how even the greatest civilizations fade into memory. Long before modern nations existed, Babylon stood at the center of the world. Between two rivers, humans learned how to turn chaos into order. They wrote the first laws, mapped the stars, built massive walls, and believed their city was chosen by the gods themselves. Kings like Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar did not just rule land. They ruled ideas. Law, justice, power, and belief were all shaped inside Babylon's walls. But greatness has a price. As Babylon rose higher than any city before it, cracks began to form beneath its foundations. Faith wavered, power shifted, enemies learned its secrets, and slowly, the city that once defined civilization itself began to disappear, not in fire and screams, but in silence. In this full history, you will witness Babylon from its birth in ancient Mesopotamia to its golden age, and finally to its quiet fall into legend. You will learn how law controlled society, how religion justified power, how science measured time, and why no empire, no matter how strong, lasts forever. This is the rise and fall of Babylon, and by the end, you will understand why its story is still our story. Long before Babylon rose to greatness, the land known as Mesopotamia already carried the weight of human civilization. The word Mesopotamia means the land between the rivers, referring to the Tigris and Euphrates. These rivers were both a gift and a danger. Their seasonal flooding deposited fertile silt that allowed agriculture to flourish. But unlike the Nile and Egypt, the floods were unpredictable. Entire villages could be destroyed overnight. This uncertainty shaped the Mesopotamian mindset. Survival required planning, cooperation, and control. Early communities learned to build irrigation canals, levees, and reservoirs. These were not small projects. They required organized labor, leadership, and rules. Over time, villages became city-states such as Ur, Uruk, Lagash, and Kish. Each city had its own ruler, its own patron god, and its own laws. Religion was deeply tied to nature. Floods, droughts, and disease were seen as signs of divine pleasure or anger. Temples became the center of both worship and administration. Writing emerged here out of necessity. At first, symbols were used to record grain, livestock, and labor. This system evolved into cuneiform, pressed into clay tablets. Writing allowed rulers to track resources, issue commands, and preserve traditions. It also created social divisions. Scribes held power because they controlled knowledge. Most people were farmers, laborers, or craftsmen, depending on the system built around them. Trade expanded across the region. Mesopotamia lacked stone, metal, and timber, so merchants traveled far to obtain resources. This constant movement spread ideas, technologies, and conflicts. War between city-states was common, as control of land and water meant survival. Stronger cities absorbed weaker ones, and kings justified conquest by claiming divine approval. Babylon began as one of many small settlements along the Euphrates. At first, it held no special importance. It had no ancient prestige like Ur or Uruk, but its location was strategic. Positioned on trade routes and near fertile lands, Babylon quietly waited while older powers rose and fell. Its true transformation would come later, when leadership, law, and ambition aligned at the right moment in history. Babylon's rise was neither sudden nor accidental. Around the early 2nd millennium BCE, the political landscape of Mesopotamia was fragmented. Amorite tribes had migrated into the region, weakening older Sumerian dynasties. This created an opening for new centers of power. Babylon was ruled by Amorite kings who understood that survival depended on unity, not just strength. One of the most important early rulers was King Hammurabi, but before his fame, Babylon was still consolidating its identity. The city expanded its walls, strengthened its defenses, and invested in religious legitimacy. Babylon's chief god, Marduk, gradually rose in importance. This was not just theology. Elevating Marduk meant elevating Babylon itself. Religion became a political tool. If Marduk was supreme among the gods, then Babylon was supreme among cities. Babylon's rulers used diplomacy as much as warfare. Alliances were formed and broken strategically. When war came, it was decisive. Hammurabi, who ruled from approximately 1792 to 1750 BCE, was both a skilled general and an administrator. He defeated powerful rivals such as Larsa and Eshnunna, eventually bringing much of Mesopotamia under Babylonian control. What set Babylon apart was not just conquest, but governance. Hammurabi understood that ruling a diverse empire required consistency. Different regions had different customs, languages, and traditions. Chaos was always a risk. To prevent rebellion and disorder, the king needed a unified system that people could recognize as legitimate and fair, even if it was harsh. Babylon became a center of learning, trade, and culture. Temples, palaces, and marketplaces flourished. The city's population grew rapidly. People from conquered regions were brought into Babylon, contributing skills and labor. This diversity strengthened the city, but also demanded structure. Without clear rules, the empire would collapse under its own weight. Babylon was no longer just a city. It was becoming an idea, a symbol of order in a dangerous world. That idea would soon be carved into stone in one of the most famous legal codes in human history. Hammurabi's code stands as one of the earliest and most complete legal systems ever recorded. Inscribed on a tall stone stele, the code was publicly displayed so that all could see it, at least in theory. At the top of the stele, Hammurabi is shown receiving authority from the sun god Shamash, the divine judge. This image was intentional. Law was not merely royal command. It was divine justice made visible through the king. The code contains nearly 300 laws covering trade, property, marriage, labor, theft, and violence. Its most famous principle is often summarized as an eye for an eye. While this phrase suggests brutality, the reality is more complex. The laws aim to limit revenge and impose standardized punishment. Instead of endless cycles of retaliation, the state controlled justice. However, the code was not equal for all. Social class mattered deeply. Punishments varied depending on whether the victim or offender was a noble, a commoner, or a slave. A crime against a wealthy man could bring severe consequences, while the same crime against a lower status person might result in a fine. This reflects the reality of Babylonian society, which was hierarchical and rigid. Despite its inequalities, Hammurabi's code was revolutionary. It established the idea that rulers were bound by law, at least symbolically. The king presented himself as a protector of the weak, the orphan, and the widow. Whether this was always true in practice is debatable, but the concept itself was powerful. The code also reveals everyday life in Babylon. We learn about contracts, wages, medical practices, and family disputes. Doctors could be rewarded for success or punished for failure. Builders were held responsible if their structures collapsed. These laws show a society deeply concerned with responsibility and order. Hammurabi's legal system helped stabilize the empire during his reign. But after his death, Babylon struggled to maintain control. External invasions and internal divisions weakened the state. Still, the legacy of Hammurabi endured. His code influenced later legal traditions and cemented Babylon's reputation as a center of law and civilization. Hammurabi's empire was powerful, but it was also fragile. Like many ancient states built around a single extraordinary ruler, Babylon struggled once that ruler was gone. Hammurabi died around 1750 BCE, leaving behind an empire that stretched across much of Mesopotamia. His successors inherited territory, but they did not inherit his authority, political skill, or military reputation. Almost immediately, cracks began to appear. The system Hammurabi created depended heavily on centralized control. Governors, military commanders, and local elites obeyed the king because Hammurabi commanded respect and fear. His successors lacked that presence. Rebellions broke out in distant regions. Former allies became enemies. Maintaining control over irrigation systems, trade routes, and city administrations became increasingly difficult. Economic pressure also grew. Continuous warfare had drained resources. Taxes were heavy, and forced labor was common. While the legal code promised justice, everyday life for farmers and laborers became harder. When a state could no longer protect communities from raids or famine, loyalty weakened. Law alone was not enough to hold the empire together. External threats worsened the situation. The Hittites from Anatolia, the Kassites from the Zagros Mountains, and other groups saw opportunity in Babylon's instability. Trade routes became dangerous. Communication across the empire slowed. Babylon itself remained wealthy and symbolic, but its grip on the surrounding regions loosened. Eventually, Babylon lost much of the territory Hammurabi had conquered. The empire shrank back towards core. The dream of a unified Mesopotamia under Babylonian rule faded. Yet Babylon did not disappear. Unlike many fallen capitals, it survived as a city, a religious center, and a cultural symbol. Its name still carried weight, even when its power did not. This period marks an important shift. Babylon was no longer defined by expansion. It was defined by endurance. The city entered a long phase of survival, adapting to foreign rulers and changing political realities while preserving its identity. One of the most surprising chapters in Babylon's history began with conquest. Around the mid-16th century BCE, the Kassites took control of Babylon. They were outsiders, originally from the eastern mountains, and at first glance, they seemed unlikely heirs to Babylonian civilization. Yet their rule lasted for nearly 400 years, one of the longest dynasties in Mesopotamian history. The Kassites did something unusual for conquerors. Instead of destroying Babylonian culture, they adopted it. They respected Babylon's gods, upheld its legal traditions, and continued using the Akkadian language for administration. Marduk remained the chief deity. Temples were restored, not replaced. This continuity gave the Kassites legitimacy in the eyes of the population. Under Kassite rule, Babylon regained a degree of stability. Large-scale wars were less frequent than in earlier periods. Agriculture recouvrée. Trade networks were rebuilt, connecting Babylon with Egypt, Anatolia, and the eastern regions. Diplomatic correspondence from this era shows Babylonian kings exchanging gifts and letters with other great powers, treating each other as equals. Culturally, this was a time of preservation and refinement. Scholars copied ancient texts, including myths, hymns, and legal documents. Astronomy and mathematics continued to develop. The idea of Babylon as a center of wisdom and learning grew stronger. Even when political power was limited, cultural influence expanded. However, Kassite rule was not without problems. Over time, corruption and internal divisions weakened the state. Provincial governors gained too much autonomy. The military became less effective. When external pressures increased again, Babylon struggled to respond decisively. Despite this, the Kassite era left a lasting mark. It proved that Babylon's strength was not only military. Its true power lay in its traditions, religion, and cultural authority. Even under foreign rule, Babylon remained Babylon. After the fall of the Kassite dynasty, Babylon entered one of its darkest periods. The region became a battleground for larger powers, particularly Assyria and Elam. Babylon was repeatedly invaded, looted, and humiliated. Its kings were overthrown, installed, and replaced at the will of stronger neighbors. The Assyrians, based in the north, were especially aggressive. They admired Babylonian culture, but also feared its influence. Some Assyrian kings presented themselves as protectors of Babylon, while others treated it as a rebellious province. This contradictory relationship led to cycles of destruction and restoration. One of the most traumatic moments came when Babylon was sacked and its sacred statues were taken away. In Mesopotamian belief, removing a god statue meant removing the god's presence. For the people of Babylon, this was not just political defeat. It was cosmic disaster. The world fell out of balance. Social life during this period was harsh. Constant warfare disrupted farming and trade. Refugees flooded the city. Law and order weakened. Yet even in chaos, Babylon did not lose its cultural gravity. Scholars continued to work. Priests maintained rituals as best they could. The memory of past greatness remained alive. Ironically, the repeated suffering strengthened Babylon's symbolic power. To rule Babylon meant more than controlling a city. It meant claiming legitimacy over Mesopotamia itself. This idea would later inspire one of the greatest revivals in ancient history. Babylon was wounded, but not dead. Its fall prepared the ground for its rise. Out of destruction, a new Babylon would emerge, greater and more magnificent than before. For much of the first millennium BCE, Babylon lived under the shadow of Assyria. The Assyrian Empire was the most militarized state the ancient world had yet seen. Its armies were disciplined, brutal, and efficient. Babylon, by contrast, was older, more symbolic, and culturally prestigious. This imbalance defined their relationship. Assyrian kings often ruled Babylon indirectly, claiming to protect its traditions while crushing any sign of independence. Despite Assyrian power, Babylonian resentment never disappeared. Rebellions were frequent, even though they were often crushed. Babylon's importance was not strategic alone. It was ideological. To rule Babylon meant legitimacy. To lose it meant shame. This paradox haunted Assyrian rulers. The turning point came in the late 7th century BCE. Assyria began to weaken under the weight of constant warfare and internal conflict. At the same time, a new Babylonian leader emerged. Nabopolassar, a local governor of Babylonian origin, led a successful revolt against Assyrian control around 626 BCE. Unlike earlier rebellions, this one endured. Nabopolassar was careful and patient. He rebuilt alliances, most importantly with the Medes, a powerful group from the Iranian plateau. Together, they launched coordinated attacks against Assyrian strongholds. In 612 BCE, the Assyrian capital of Nineveh fell. This event shocked the ancient world. The empire that had dominated the Near East for centuries collapsed in flames. With Assyria gone, Babylon reclaimed its place as a great power. Nabopolassar established the Neo-Babylonian Empire, presenting it not as something new, but as a restoration of rightful order. Babylon, once humiliated and broken, stood again at the center of history. This revival was deeply emotional for the Babylonians. Temples were restored, rituals renewed, and old texts revisited. The past was not forgotten. It was revived and reshaped to justify the present. If Nabopolassar laid the foundation, it was his son Nebuchadnezzar II who turned Babylon into a legend. Ruling from approximately 605 to 562 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar was one of the most powerful kings of the ancient world. He was a brilliant military commander, a shrewd administrator, and a visionary builder. Militarily, Nebuchadnezzar expanded Babylon's control across the Near East. He defeated the Egyptians, secured Syria and Phoenicia, and subdued rebellious regions. One of the most famous events of his reign was the conquest of Jerusalem and the exile of its population to Babylon. This act had lasting consequences, especially in biblical tradition, where Babylon became a symbol of power and judgment. But Nebuchadnezzar's greatest legacy was not war. It was construction. He transformed Babylon into the most magnificent city of its time. Massive walls surrounded the city, wide enough for chariots to ride atop them. Gates decorated with glazed blue bricks and images of dragons and bulls honored Marduk and other gods. Palaces rose along the Euphrates, combining beauty with authority. The city became a statement of imperial confidence. Every brick bore inscriptions declaring Nebuchadnezzar's greatness and devotion to the gods. Power was meant to be seen and felt. Administration under Nebuchadnezzar was efficient. Taxes flowed into the capital. Labor was organized on a massive scale. Skilled artisans from across the empire were brought to Babylon. This diversity enriched the city culturally, but also reinforced imperial dominance. Nebuchadnezzar ruled not just through fear, but through spectacle. Babylon was meant to overwhelm visitors. It succeeded. Ancient writers described it with awe, and its reputation spread far beyond its borders. Among the wonders attributed to Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, none captured imagination like the Hanging Gardens. Though their exact existence remains debated, ancient descriptions portray a series of terrace gardens filled with exotic plants, rising above the city. According to tradition, they were built to please a queen who longed for the green hills of her homeland. Whether literal or symbolic, the Hanging Gardens represent something deeper. They reflect Babylon's ability to bend nature to human will. Water was lifted from the Euphrates through complex engineering systems, allowing plants to thrive high above the ground. This was not just beauty, it was power over environment. Culturally, Babylon reached its peak during this era. Scholars studied astronomy, tracking planets and eclipses with remarkable precision. Mathematics advanced, using base 60 systems that still influence how we measure time today. Religious rituals were carefully maintained, linking the present to the ancient past. Babylon was also a city of stories. Myths were copied and preserved. Epic traditions continued. Law, though less centralized than under Hammurabi, still shaped social life. The idea of order remained central to Babylonian identity. Yet beneath the splendor, signs of fragility existed. The empire depended heavily on strong leadership. Succession was always dangerous. The system worked because Nebuchadnezzar held it together. Without him, cracks would widen quickly. Babylon stood at its highest point, admired and feared across the world. But history rarely allows greatness to last untouched. Religion was the heart of Babylonian life. It shaped politics, law, science, and identity. Babylon was not simply a city with temples. It was a sacred center where the gods were believed to actively maintain cosmic order. At the top of this divine hierarchy stood Marduk, the city's patron god, whose rise mirrored Babylon's political ascent. Every year, the most important religious event was the Akitu festival, the New Year celebration. During this ritual, priests reenacted the creation myth, emphasizing Marduk's victory over chaos. The king played a crucial role. He was temporarily stripped of his symbols of power and humiliated before the god, then restored to authority. This ritual reinforced a powerful idea. Kings ruled only with divine approval, and order depended on humility before the gods. Temples were economic as well as religious institutions. They owned land, employed workers, stored grain, and distributed resources. Priests held significant influence, often rivaling royal authority. This balance between temple and throne was delicate. When harmony existed, Babylon thrived. When tension arose, instability followed. Religion also shaped Babylonian views of fate and morality. The gods were seen as unpredictable. Humans could follow rituals and laws perfectly and still suffer. This created a culture deeply invested in divination. Omens were read in the stars, in animal entrails, and in dreams. Astronomy was not abstract science. It was a way to understand divine will. As Babylon grew more powerful and cosmopolitan, its religious life became more complex. Foreign gods were incorporated into the pantheon. This inclusiveness strengthened Babylon's appeal, but also diluted traditional authority. Old rituals remained, but beliefs slowly became more formal than heartfelt for some. Religion held Babylon together, but it also made the city vulnerable. If disaster struck, it was interpreted as divine displeasure. When enemies approached, people questioned whether the gods had abandoned them. Faith that once unified could also undermine confidence when times turned dark. At its height, Babylon was one of the most diverse cities the ancient world had ever seen. Conquests brought people from across the Near East. Traders, artisans, prisoners, and administrators filled its streets. Languages mixed. Customs overlapped. Babylon became a true imperial capital. One of the most historically significant populations in Babylon were the exiled Judeans. After the destruction of Jerusalem, many were relocated to Babylon. Unlike earlier mass killings common in Assyrian policy, the Babylonians practiced controlled exile. Skilled populations were preserved and integrated into the economy. This experience deeply shaped religious thought. For the Judeans, Babylon was both a place of suffering and reflection. Their writings from this period portray Babylon as powerful, arrogant, and temporary. These texts would later influence global religious traditions, shaping how Babylon was remembered long after its fall. For the Babylonians themselves, managing diversity was both strength and challenge. Foreign labor fueled massive building projects. Trade flourished, but loyalty became complicated. Many residents did not feel deep attachment to Babylonian identity. They lived under its power, not for it. Administratively, this required constant surveillance and control. Officials tracked populations carefully. Law was enforced strictly, yet resentment simmered beneath the surface. When authority weakened, unity quickly dissolved. Babylon's image as a world city spread far beyond its walls. Merchants spoke of its wealth. Scholars admired its knowledge. Prophets condemned its pride. Babylon became more than a place. It became an idea, admired and feared at the same time. But global cities are fragile. They depend on stability, confidence, and constant movement of resources. When those systems falter, collapse can be sudden and dramatic. After Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon's decline accelerated. His successors lacked his authority and vision. Court intrigue became common. Kings were overthrown, assassinated, or replaced rapidly. Each change weakened trust and leadership. Economic strain grew. Massive construction projects had drained resources. Maintaining temples, walls, and palaces required constant labor and wealth. As trade routes shifted and military costs rose, the state struggled to keep up. The priesthood and royal court increasingly clashed. Religious authority resented political interference, while kings feared priestly power. This tension eroded cooperation at the highest levels of society. Meanwhile, a new power was rising to the east. The Persians, under Cyrus, were expanding rapidly. Unlike earlier conquerors, they presented themselves as liberators rather than destroyers. Their reputation spread faster than their armies. Within Babylon, confidence eroded. Omens were interpreted pessimistically. Stories circulated of divine anger. The belief that Marduk might abandon the city gained ground. This psychological shift was crucial. Cities fall first in the mind before they fall by force. By the time the Persian army approached, Babylon was still rich and fortified, but spiritually divided and politically exhausted. The city that once symbolized eternal order now felt uncertain of its place in the world. The end was approaching, not with flames and chaos, but with quiet inevitability. While Babylon struggled with internal weakness, a new force was reshaping the political map of the ancient Near East. This force was Persia. Unlike earlier empires that grew slowly over generations, the Persian state expanded with astonishing speed. At its center stood Cyrus II, later known as Cyrus the Great, one of the most influential rulers in world history. Cyrus began as the king of a relatively small Persian tribe under the domination of the Medes. Through a combination of rebellion, diplomacy, and military skill, he overthrew his Median overlords and united the Iranian plateau. But Cyrus did not stop there. He turned outward, conquering Lydia and Anatolia, and absorbing vast territories without destroying their institutions. What made Cyrus different was not only his success, but his method. Instead of ruling through terror, he ruled through accommodation. Local customs were respected. Religious traditions were preserved. Former enemies were often incorporated into the imperial system rather than eliminated. This approach earned Cyrus loyalty where others inspired fear. News of Persian expansion reached Babylon long before Persian soldiers did. Babylonian elites observed carefully. They compared their own unstable leadership with Cyrus's reputation for justice and order. In contrast to Babylon's weakened kings, Cyrus appeared decisive and confident. Babylon was no longer the center of the world. It was now one great city among many, facing an empire that spanned continents. The psychological balance had shifted. Even before the first battle, the idea of Babylonian invincibility had faded. Persia represented a new model of power. It did not seek to erase history. It absorbed it. For a city like Babylon, rich in tradition but poor in unity, this approach would prove decisive. In 539 BCE, Cyrus turned his attention fully toward Babylon. Unlike earlier invasions that relied on prolonged sieges and devastating assaults, the Persian approach was calculated and restrained. Babylon's massive walls were legendary. A direct attack would have been costly and uncertain. Instead, Cyrus exploited Babylon's internal divisions. Some Babylonian priests and officials were dissatisfied with their king, Nabonidus, whose religious policies had alienated the priesthood of Marduk. Cyrus positioned himself as a restorer of proper worship, not a conqueror. According to later accounts, Persian forces diverted the Euphrates River, allowing troops to enter the city through the riverbed while Babylonian defenses were unprepared. Whether this detail is literal or symbolic, the outcome is clear. Babylon fell with remarkably little resistance. There was no widespread destruction. Temples were spared. The population was not massacred. Cyrus entered Babylon as a liberator in the eyes of many. He performed rituals honoring Babylonian gods, presenting himself as chosen by Marduk to rule. This moment marked the end of Babylonian political independence. But culturally, Babylon remained important. Cyrus did not erase Babylon's identity. He preserved it within a larger imperial framework. The fall of Babylon was quiet compared to earlier collapses. That silence was significant. It signaled a shift in how empires functioned. Power no longer required constant brutality. Legitimacy could be claimed through tolerance and respect. Babylon's fall was not just a military event. It was a philosophical turning point in imperial history. After the conquest, Babylon became one of the key administrative centers of the Persian Empire. It retained wealth, population, and prestige, but it no longer stood alone. It was part of something far larger. Cyrus issued proclamations allowing displaced peoples to return to their homelands and restore their temples. For the Judeans, this meant the end of exile and the rebuilding of Jerusalem. These acts strengthened Cyrus's reputation as a just ruler and reshaped how Babylon was remembered in later religious traditions. Administratively, Persian rule was efficient. Local elites were kept in place where possible. Taxes were standardized. Roads and communication networks expanded across the empire. Babylon benefited economically, but its political voice diminished. Religiously, Babylon continued its rituals, but the idea of Marduk as supreme over all lands no longer matched reality. The gods of many nations now coexisted under Persian rule. Babylon's spiritual centrality faded. Over time, Babylon became a symbol rather than a power. Scholars still worked there. Astronomers continued their observations. But decisions affecting the world were made elsewhere. Cyrus's conquest marked the true end of Babylon as an empire, even if the city itself endured for centuries. The rise and fall cycle had completed another turn. Babylon had shaped history through law, culture, architecture, and belief. Now it entered history as memory. After its conquest by Cyrus the Great, Babylon entered a new phase of existence. It was no longer the heart of an independent empire, but it did not become an insignificant city either. Under Persian rule, Babylon was transformed into one of the most important administrative centers of the Achaemenid Empire. This shift fundamentally changed how the city functioned and how its people understood their place in the world. Persian governance relied on a system of provinces, often called satrapies. Babylon was placed within this structure, governed by officials who answered to the Persian king. Local administrators, scribes, and priests continued their work, but ultimate authority now lay elsewhere. Laws were enforced in the king's name. Taxes were collected for an empire that stretched from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea. Economically, Babylon remained prosperous. Its fertile lands continued to produce grain. Trade routes passing through the city were integrated into Persian networks. Merchants benefited from improved roads and standardized systems of weights and measures. In daily life, many Babylonians experienced stability rather than hardship. Yet something essential had changed. Political initiative was gone. Babylon no longer decided the fate of regions or peoples. Decisions came from distant capitals. The city's role was to serve, not to command. for a population raised on memories of Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar. This loss of agency was deeply felt. Religiously, Persian rulers showed tolerance. Temples were maintained and rituals continued. But the symbolic claim that Marduk ruled the world through Babylonian kings was no longer credible. The spiritual logic of empire had shifted. Babylon survived, but survival was not the same as leadership. The city was now part of history rather than its author. Despite initial cooperation, Babylonian resentment toward Persian rule gradually surfaced. The city's elites remembered past greatness, and not all accepted permanent subordination. Over time, several revolts broke out, revealing the limits of Persian tolerance. Early Persian kings worked hard to present themselves as legitimate rulers of Babylon. They participated in religious ceremonies and respected local traditions. However, later rulers were less attentive. Administrative pressures increased. Taxes grew heavier. The sense that Babylon mattered less than before became harder to ignore. Rebellions were swift but poorly coordinated. Persian military power was overwhelming. Each uprising was crushed decisively. Punishments followed, sometimes including the destruction of city walls or the removal of sacred statues. These acts struck at Babylon's identity, signaling that resistance would not be tolerated. The psychological impact was severe. Each failed revolt weakened confidence further. The belief that Babylon could reclaim independence faded. What remained was cultural pride without political hope. Persian rule also altered social structures. Some Babylonian elites adapted, serving the empire and benefiting personally. Others lost influence. This created divisions within society, eroding unity. By the late Persian period, Babylon was no longer rebellious, not because it was content, but because it was exhausted. Resistance gave way to resignation. In the late 4th century BCE, a new conqueror appeared, one who would reshape the ancient world once again. Alexander of Macedon defeated the Persian Empire with astonishing speed. When he entered Babylon in 331 BCE, he was welcomed as a liberator. Alexander admired Babylon deeply. He respected its antiquity, its scholarship, and its strategic position. For a moment, it seemed possible that Babylon might regain central importance. Alexander even planned to make it one of his imperial capitals. However, history intervened. Alexander died suddenly in Babylon in 323 BC. His empire fractured almost immediately. The city became a prize contested by his successors. Warfare returned. Stability vanished. Gradually, political focus shifted elsewhere. New cities were founded. Trade routes changed. Babylon's population declined. Temples fell into disrepair. The once glorious city faded into obscurity. By the time Roman writers spoke of Babylon, it was already a ruin, a name heavy with meaning, but no longer alive. Babylon's fall was not sudden. It was slow, layered, and inevitable. The city that once defined law, culture, and empire became a memory, preserved in texts, myths, and imagination. After Babylon ceased to function as a political power, it did not disappear from human consciousness. In many ways, its afterlife and memory became more powerful than its historical reality. Ancient civilizations rarely forgot cities that once dominated the world, and Babylon was remembered not simply as a fallen capital, but as a symbol of human ambition, order, excess, and divine judgment. For Mesopotamian scholars, Babylon remained the intellectual ancestor of their traditions. Astronomical texts, mathematical tables, and mythological narratives continued to be copied for centuries. Even when the city itself declined, its intellectual legacy lived on in libraries far beyond its ruins. Babylon became a reference point, a golden age against which later generations measured decline. Outside Mesopotamia, Babylon took on darker meanings. In Hebrew prophetic literature, Babylon became the embodiment of arrogance and oppression. It was remembered less as a city of law and learning, and more as the destroyer of Jerusalem and a captor of a people. This selective memory shaped how Babylon would be understood in later religious traditions. What is important here is not whether these portrayals were fair, but why they endured. Babylon represented centralized power at its most visible. Its walls, temples, and palaces were expressions of human control over nature and society. When such power collapses, it invites moral interpretation. People search for lessons, warnings, and meaning. Thus, Babylon shifted from geography to metaphor. It was no longer only a place on the Euphrates. It became an idea that could be invoked whenever power seemed excessive or corrupt. This transformation ensured that Babylon would never truly vanish, even as its physical remains crumbled into dust. The strongest and most enduring image of Babylon in global culture comes from biblical tradition. In the Hebrew Bible and later Christian writings, Babylon is portrayed as both a real historical empire and a symbol of moral decay. This dual role profoundly influenced Western thought. The Babylonian exile was a traumatic event for the Jewish people. It forced a rethinking of faith, identity, and history. Prophets wrote about Babylon not only as a conqueror, but as an instrument of divine judgment. Later texts went further, portraying Babylon as doomed by its own pride. In the book of Revelation, written centuries after Babylon's fall, the name Babylon is used symbolically to represent oppressive imperial power. By this time, the original city no longer mattered. What mattered was what Babylon had come to mean: luxury built on suffering, authority without justice, power without humility. Greek and Roman writers offered a different but related view. Historians like Herodotus described Babylon with fascination and skepticism. They marveled at its scale while questioning its excesses. For them, Babylon represented the strange and ancient East, wealthy and mysterious, but ultimately surpassed by newer powers. These traditions fixed Babylon's image in global memory. The city became timeless, detached from its specific historical periods. Hammurabi, Nebuchadnezzar, and Cyrus blended into a single narrative of rise and fall. Complexity was simplified, meaning replaced detail. This process is not unique to Babylon, but Babylon may be the clearest example of how history becomes myth. Modern archaeology has allowed Babylon to re-emerge, not as myth, but as a real place shaped by human choices. Beginning in the 19th century, excavations uncovered walls, gates, inscriptions, and tablets that transformed scholarly understanding. The discovery of Hammurabi's code revealed Babylon as a legal innovator, not merely a tyrant. Astronomical records showed scientific precision unmatched for centuries. Administrative tablets exposed the routines of daily life, contracts, wages, and disputes. These findings complicated older moral narratives. Babylon was neither purely evil nor purely glorious. It was human. Its rulers sought order and power. Its people lived, worked, believed, and adapted. Modern historians now see Babylon as a foundational civilization. Its contributions to law, timekeeping, urban planning, and governance shaped later societies directly and indirectly. Even its failures taught lessons about imperial overreach and dependence on centralized authority. Today, Babylon stands as a reminder that civilizations are fragile. not because they lack achievement, but because achievement creates expectations that are hard to sustain. Babylon rose through organization and vision. It fell through division, exhaustion, and changing historical currents. The rise and fall of Babylon is not a closed chapter. It is a mirror held up to every society that believes its power is permanent. While Hammurabi's code is the most famous Babylonian legal text, law in Babylon was not frozen in stone after his reign. Legal practice continued to evolve for centuries, adapting to new rulers, social changes, and economic realities. What made Babylon unique was not just the existence of laws, but how deeply legal thinking penetrated everyday life. Babylonian society relied heavily on written contracts. Marriage agreements, business partnerships, land sales, loans, and labor arrangements were carefully recorded on clay tablets. These documents were witnessed, sealed, and archived. Law was not abstract. It was practical, transactional, and routine. Even ordinary people interacted with the legal system regularly. Judges played a key role, often drawn from respected members of the community. While corruption existed, legal procedure mattered. Testimony, evidence, and precedent were considered. Punishments could be harsh, but they followed established rules rather than arbitrary violence. Social hierarchy remained central. Nobles, commoners, and slaves were treated differently under the law. Yet even slaves had recognized rights. They could own property, conduct business, and sometimes purchase their freedom. This complexity challenges simplistic views of ancient societies as purely oppressive. Law reinforced order in a crowded, diverse city. Babylon depended on predictability. Contracts ensured trust between strangers. Courts resolved disputes without endless revenge. This legal culture was one of Babylon's greatest achievements, shaping how later civilizations understood justice as a system rather than personal power. Babylon was one of the earliest centers of scientific thought, though science and religion were never fully separated. Babylonian scholars believed the universe was ordered and that careful observation could reveal its patterns. This belief drove remarkable advances in astronomy and mathematics. Babylonian astronomers tracked the movements of planets, stars, and the moon with extraordinary precision. They recorded eclipses, developed predictive models, and identified repeating cycles. These observations were motivated by divination, but the methods were rigorous. Over time, prediction became increasingly accurate. Mathematically, Babylonians used a base 60 system, which still influences modern timekeeping and geometry. They solved complex equations, calculated areas, and understood relationships that would later be formalized in Greek mathematics. These scholars worked in temples and royal institutions, supported by the state. Knowledge was power. Accurate predictions reinforced the authority of kings and priests, linking cosmic order to political stability. Science in Babylon was not theoretical for its own sake. It served governance, agriculture, and ritual life. Calendars regulated festivals and farming. Astronomy guided decision-making. Mathematics supported trade and construction. Babylon's scientific legacy is one of careful observation and practical application. It reminds us that systematic knowledge did not begin in modern times. It began in cities like Babylon, where survival demanded understanding. Beyond law and science, Babylon was a city of ordinary lives. Families lived in mud brick houses clustered along narrow streets. Extended families were common, and household authority rested with the male head, though women held defined legal and economic roles. Women could own property, engage in business, and initiate divorce under certain conditions. Marriage was both a social and economic institution, governed by contracts outlining rights and responsibilities. Children were expected to support parents in old age, reinforcing family bonds. Work defined daily rhythm. Farmers labored in fields outside the city. Artisans crafted goods for local use and trade. Merchants traveled long distances, connecting Babylon to distant lands. Slavery existed, but it was often temporary and debt-related rather than purely racial or permanent. Religion shaped daily routines. Offerings, prayers, and rituals marked time. People feared the gods, but also sought their protection. Illness, misfortune, and success were all interpreted through a religious lens. Despite inequality and hardship, Babylonian society was resilient. Its people adapted to invasions, regime changes, and economic shifts. They preserved traditions while absorbing new influences. This everyday resilience explains Babylon's long survival. Empires fell, kings vanished, but daily life continued. It is in these ordinary lives that Babylon truly endured. Babylonian warfare was shaped by geography, economy, and political necessity. Mesopotamia's open plains offered little natural defense, which meant cities had to rely on walls, armies, and strategic alliances to survive. Babylon's military was not constantly mobilized like the later Assyrian war machine, but it was capable, organized, and deeply tied to state authority. Babylonian armies were largely composed of infantry, supported by archers and spearmen. Soldiers were often drawn from the population through obligations tied to land ownership. Military service was part of civic duty. In times of major conflict, mercenaries and allied troops supplemented local forces. Weapons were practical rather than elaborate. Spears, bows, shields, and later iron tools dominated the battlefield. Chariots were used, but not with the same overwhelming emphasis seen in other cultures. Babylonian warfare focused less on shock and terror and more on control, sieges, and attrition. City walls were central to defense. Babylon's fortifications became legendary, especially under Nebuchadnezzar II. These walls were not merely defensive structures. They were symbols of power and permanence. A city that could not be taken easily commanded respect. War was costly. Campaigns disrupted agriculture and trade. For this reason, Babylonian kings often preferred diplomacy when possible. Warfare was a means to stability, not an end in itself. When war was necessary, it was justified through religious language, presenting victory as divine will. This approach made Babylon resilient, but also vulnerable. Against enemies who embraced total war, such as the Assyrians, Babylon sometimes struggled. Its military culture reflected its broader values: order, continuity, and legitimacy over raw brutality. Diplomacy was as important to Babylon as military strength. Mesopotamia was a crowded political landscape, filled with city-states, kingdoms, and empires. Survival depended on careful negotiation, marriage alliances, treaties, and shifting loyalties. Babylonian kings maintained extensive correspondence with foreign rulers. These letters reveal a world where gifts, titles, and mutual recognition mattered deeply. Kings addressed one another as brothers or equals, reinforcing a shared elite culture even among rivals. Marriage alliances were common. Royal daughters were exchanged to secure peace or cooperation. These unions were political tools, binding states together through family ties. When alliances failed, betrayal carried personal as well as political consequences. Babylon often positioned itself as a mediator. Its cultural prestige gave it influence beyond its military reach. Smaller states sought Babylonian recognition to legitimize their rule. This soft power was a critical asset. However, diplomacy required strength to be credible. When Babylon weakened internally, its alliances collapsed quickly. Partners shifted toward rising powers. Treaties were ignored. Diplomacy without force proved fragile. The Neo-Babylonian revival demonstrated how effective diplomacy could be when backed by military success. Nabopolassar's alliance with the Medes was decisive against Assyria. Later, Babylon struggled when it could no longer command respect. Babylon's diplomatic history shows that power is relational. It exists not only in armies, but in perception. When others believed in Babylon's strength, it mattered. When belief faded, reality followed. Behind strategies and treaties lay the human experience of war. For ordinary Babylonians, warfare meant disruption, fear, and loss. Fields were abandoned. Families were displaced. Cities filled with refugees. Sieges were especially devastating. Starvation, disease, and despair often killed more people than combat itself. Even victorious wars left scars. Veterans returned injured or traumatized. Labor shortages followed prolonged campaigns. Religious interpretation shaped how people understood suffering. Defeat was seen as divine displeasure. Victory as divine favor. This belief intensified emotional responses to war. Trauma was not only physical, it was spiritual. Captivity and forced relocation were common outcomes. Skilled workers were moved across empires. Families were separated. Yet these movements also spread knowledge and culture, creating unintended connections. Babylonian texts record prayers for protection, laments for destroyed cities, and rituals for purification after war. These sources remind us that ancient people experienced fear and grief as deeply as modern ones. Warfare contributed to Babylon's rise, but also hastened its fall. Continuous conflict drained resources and unity. The same systems that supported expansion eventually produced exhaustion. Babylon's military history is not a story of constant triumph. It is a story of balance, strain, and consequence. Power gained through war demanded maintenance. When that maintenance failed, collapse followed. Babylon was not a city that grew randomly. Its layout reflected centuries of planning shaped by geography, religion, and political authority. Built along the Euphrates River, the city was divided into districts that balanced practical needs with symbolic meaning. Streets, canals, temples, and residential areas formed an interconnected system designed to support a large population and project imperial power. The Euphrates was central to Babylon's design. It provided water, transport, and economic lifelines. Canals branched from the river, supplying fields and neighborhoods while also acting as internal transportation routes. Bridges connected the eastern and western halves of the city, integrating commerce and administration. Residential areas varied by social class. Wealthy families lived closer to temples and administrative centers, often in larger courtyard houses. Poorer residents occupied denser neighborhoods with narrower streets. Despite inequality, urban planning ensured access to water, markets, and religious spaces for all. Public spaces were carefully placed. Processional roads linked temples and palaces, especially the route used during the New Year festival. These roads were wide, paved, and visually striking, reinforcing the connection between religion and state power. Babylon's urban design served control as much as comfort. Streets could be monitored. Districts could be isolated if unrest occurred. The city was both home and instrument of authority. This balance of function and symbolism made Babylon one of the most advanced cities of its time. It was not just lived in, it was experienced. Monumental architecture defined Babylon's identity. Temples and palaces dominated the skyline, constructed to inspire awe and reinforce cosmic order. These structures were not merely buildings. They were statements about the relationship between gods, kings, and people. The most important temple complex was dedicated to Marduk. It stood at the spiritual heart of the city. Nearby rose the ziggurat, a massive step tower believed to connect heaven and earth. Rituals performed here reaffirmed Babylon's role as the center of the universe. Royal palaces were equally imposing. Nebuchadnezzar II expanded them dramatically, creating vast complexes with courtyards, throne rooms, and gardens. These spaces were designed for ceremony, administration, and display. Foreign envoys entering these halls were meant to feel small. Construction relied heavily on mud brick, a practical choice in a region lacking stone. To compensate, Babylonians used glazed bricks, inscriptions, and reliefs to add color and permanence. Walls were decorated with symbols of gods and mythical creatures, blending art with ideology. Building projects required enormous labor and resources. They employed thousands, including skilled artisans and forced laborers. Architecture, thus, shaped the economy and reinforced hierarchy. Through architecture, Babylon told a story about itself. It was ancient, powerful, and divinely favored. Even when political power waned, these monuments preserved memory. Babylon's walls were among the most famous in the ancient world. They were not just defensive structures. They were symbols of invincibility. Multiple layers of walls surrounded the city, reinforced by towers and gates that controlled movement in and out. The gates were especially important. Each was dedicated to a deity and decorated accordingly. The Ishtar Gate, with its deep blue glazed bricks and reliefs of lions, dragons, and bulls, served as both a defensive checkpoint and a ceremonial entrance. Walls shaped psychology. They gave residents a sense of security and identity. To live within Babylon's walls was to belong to something greater. Yet walls can also create false confidence. Babylon's fall to Persia demonstrated that even the strongest fortifications cannot protect a city divided from within. The walls remained standing, but belief in their power had already weakened. In the end, Babylon's physical greatness outlasted its political strength. Ruins remained long after rulers were forgotten. Architecture was Babylon's voice across time. Through brick and space, it spoke of ambition, order, and human effort on a monumental scale. Babylon's wealth did not begin in markets or palaces. It began in the soil. Agriculture was the foundation of the Babylonian economy, and without it, none of the city's achievements would have been possible. The fertile land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers allowed Babylon to sustain a large population, support specialists, and fund monumental projects. Irrigation was the key. Canals redirected river water into fields, making farming possible even in dry seasons. Maintaining these canals required constant labor and coordination. The state played a central role, organizing workers and enforcing rules. Neglect could lead to flooding or drought, both disastrous. Land ownership was complex. Temples, the royal household, and private individuals all owned land. Tenants farmed plots in exchange for rent or a share of the harvest. Contracts specified obligations clearly. Failure to meet them could result in debt, loss of land, or temporary enslavement. Grain was the primary crop, especially barley. It served as food, trade commodity, and even currency. Wages were often paid in grain. Taxes were collected in grain. Storage facilities were essential, allowing the state to manage shortages and distribute supplies. Agriculture tied people to the state. Farmers depended on irrigation systems controlled by authorities. In return, the state relied on farmers for survival. This mutual dependence stabilized society, but also made it vulnerable. When war disrupted canals or labor, the entire economy suffered. Babylon's agricultural system was efficient but fragile. It supported greatness, but only as long as order was maintained. Babylon's location made it a natural center of trade. Situated at the crossroads of Mesopotamia, it connected regions rich in different resources. While Babylon lacked stone, timber, and metals, it compensated through trade. Merchants traveled along rivers and overland routes, bringing goods from Anatolia, the Levant, Iran, and beyond. Tin, copper, gold, cedar wood, textiles, spices, and luxury items passed through Babylon's markets. In return, Babylon exported grain, dates, textiles, and manufactured goods. Trade was regulated through contracts and partnerships. Merchants often pooled resources to reduce risk. Loans financed expeditions. Profits and losses were carefully recorded. This commercial sophistication made Babylon an early example of a complex market economy. The state supported trade by maintaining roads, enforcing contracts, and providing security. Temples also played a role, financing trade ventures and storing goods. Economic activity was deeply integrated with religious and political institutions. Markets were lively places. Prices fluctuated based on supply and demand. Disputes were common and resolved through courts. Trade created wealth, but also inequality. Successful merchants rose in status, while debt trapped others. Babylon's trade networks extended its influence far beyond its borders. Even when political power declined, economic connections kept the city relevant. Babylon was wealthy, but that wealth was unevenly distributed. Kings, priests, and large landowners controlled vast resources. Ordinary citizens lived modestly. Slaves and debtors lived precariously. Debt was a constant risk. Crop failure, illness, or misfortune could push families into borrowing. Interest rates were high. Failure to repay could result in loss of land or freedom. Legal protections existed, but they favored creditors. The state attempted to manage inequality. Periodic debt forgiveness and legal reforms aimed to prevent total collapse. Hammurabi's code included measures to limit exploitation, though enforcement varied. Wealth funded culture and architecture, but it also bred resentment. Economic tension contributed to instability, especially during periods of weak leadership. When people felt the system no longer served them, loyalty faded. Babylon's economy was powerful but delicate. It thrived on organization, trust, and stability. When those elements weakened, prosperity turned into vulnerability. Economic success built Babylon's greatness. Economic strain helped undo it. Writing was one of Babylon's most enduring contributions to human civilization. Long before Babylon reached imperial greatness, Mesopotamian societies had already developed cuneiform, a writing system impressed in a clay with a reed stylus. By the time Babylon rose to prominence, writing had become the backbone of administration, law, economy, religion, and memory itself. Babylonian writing was not alphabetic. It was complex, requiring the memorization of hundreds of signs. Learning to write demanded years of training. Because of this difficulty, literacy was limited to a small but powerful group known as scribes. These individuals occupied a respected position in society. They worked for temples, palaces, courts, and merchants. Without them, the state could not function. Writing preserved contracts, laws, letters, myths, scientific observations, and prayers. A written agreement carried authority beyond spoken words. It could be stored, referenced, and enforced. This permanence created accountability and continuity across generations. Clay tablets were durable and plentiful. Once dried or fired, they could last for millennia. This material choice unintentionally turned Babylon into one of the best documented ancient civilizations. Even mundane records survived, giving modern historians a rare window into daily life. Writing also shaped power. Kings ruled through decrees recorded in writing. Priests interpreted sacred texts. Merchants depended on written contracts. Knowledge became institutional rather than personal. Babylon was not governed only by memory or tradition, but by archives. In Babylon, to control writing was to control reality. This understanding elevated education into a political act. Education in Babylon was formal, disciplined, and demanding. Scribal schools trained students, usually sons of elite families, in reading, writing, mathematics, and specialized knowledge. These schools were rigorous. Students copied texts repeatedly, memorizing signs and formulas through constant practice. Discipline was strict. Texts survive in which students complain about beatings and exhaustion. Education was not romanticized. It was an obligation and a privilege. Only those who endured it gained access to power and security. Curricula included practical texts such as contracts and legal cases, as well as literary works like myths, hymns, and epics. Students copied older Sumerian texts long after Sumerian was no longer spoken. This preserved ancient traditions and reinforced continuity with the past. Advanced education specialized further. Some scribes focused on law, others on astronomy, medicine, or ritual. Knowledge was compartmentalized, but interconnected. Astronomy informed religion. Mathematics supported architecture and trade. Medicine combined observation with ritual. Transmission of knowledge depended on copying. There was no printing. Each tablet was handmade. Errors were corrected, variations introduced. This process allowed ideas to evolve while remaining anchored in tradition. Babylonian education valued preservation over innovation. Yet within this conservative framework, remarkable intellectual progress occurred. Stability allowed refinement. Knowledge in Babylon was cumulative. Each generation stood on clay tablets, shaped by the hands of those before them. Babylon housed extensive archives and libraries, particularly in temples and palaces. These collections were not libraries in the modern sense, but organized repositories of knowledge. Tablets were categorized by subject, author, or purpose. This organization reflects a conscious effort to manage information systematically. Libraries contained legal records, administrative documents, literary texts, scientific observations, and religious instructions. Some texts were copied for centuries, suggesting canonical status. Others were updated as new data emerged, especially in astronomy. The existence of archives changed how Babylonians understood time. History was recorded. Precedent mattered. Past decisions informed present action. This historical consciousness distinguished Babylon from purely oral cultures. Babylonian intellectual influence extended far beyond the city itself. Assyrian libraries preserved Babylonian texts. Greek scholars later encountered Babylonian astronomy and mathematics, often without fully acknowledging their sources. Even after Babylon's political decline, its knowledge survived elsewhere. Ideas outlived buildings. Tablets traveled. Traditions migrated. Today, modern science, law, and education still echo Babylonian practices. The idea that knowledge should be recorded, preserved, and taught systematically is one of Babylon's greatest gifts to humanity. Babylon fell as a city, but it endured as a mind. Babylonian art was never created for decoration alone. Every image, symbol, and structure carried meaning tied to power, religion, and social order. Art was a language through which Babylon expressed how the universe worked and where humans stood within it. Much of Babylonian art was functional and symbolic rather than personal. Reliefs, statues, seals, and wall decorations served political and religious purposes. Kings commissioned images that showed them favored by the gods, victorious in battle, or maintaining cosmic order. These images reinforced authority without words. Common artistic materials included clay, stone, bronze, and glazed brick. Cylinder seals were especially important. These small carved objects were rolled onto wet clay to mark ownership or approval. Each seal told a story through symbols and scenes, combining identity, status, and belief. Animals played a central role in Babylonian art. Lions symbolized power and protection. Bulls represented strength and fertility. Hybrid creatures reflected the boundary between order and chaos. These images were not fantasy for entertainment. They represented forces believed to shape reality. Art was deeply integrated into daily life. Homes contained protective symbols. Temples displayed sacred images. Public spaces reinforced shared values. Even ordinary objects carried meaning. Babylonian art was conservative. Styles changed slowly. Continuity mattered more than innovation. This consistency reinforced tradition and stability, connecting present generations to ancient ancestors. Through art, Babylon made its worldview visible. Order was fragile. Power was sacred. Humanity stood between gods and chaos. Babylonian mythology was not abstract storytelling. It explained existence itself. The most important myth was the creation epic known as the Enuma Elish. This story described how the god Marduk defeated the chaos monster Tiamat and created the world from her body. This myth mattered because it justified Babylon's dominance. Marduk's rise mirrored Babylon's rise. Just as Marduk imposed order on chaos, Babylon imposed order on the world. Politics and theology were inseparable. The gods in Babylonian mythology were powerful but flawed. They argued, feared, and needed reassurance. Humans were created to serve the gods, relieving them of labor. This worldview shaped attitudes toward work, suffering, and obedience. Chaos was a constant threat. Floods, disease, invasion, and famine were seen as reminders that order could collapse. Rituals, prayers, and festivals aimed to renew balance. The New Year festival symbolized this renewal annually. Myths were recited, copied, and taught. They reinforced identity and explained misfortune. When Babylon fell to Persia, some believed it meant Marduk had withdrawn his favor. Babylonian mythology offered meaning in uncertainty. It taught that order was not permanent. It had to be maintained through obedience, ritual, and authority. This belief shaped Babylon's resilience and its fear. Babylon's artistic and mythological traditions influenced cultures far beyond Mesopotamia. Assyrians adopted Babylonian myths. Persians respected Babylonian religious structures. Greek writers absorbed Babylonian cosmology indirectly. Even biblical traditions reflect Babylonian influence. Creation stories, flood narratives, and symbolic language echo Mesopotamian myths. These ideas were adapted and reinterpreted, but their roots remain visible. Modern perceptions of Babylon are shaped more by myth and history. Babylon is remembered as a place of grandeur, excess, and moral warning. This image emerged because Babylon understood the power of narrative. Art and myth allowed Babylon to define itself and influence how others saw it. Even after its physical decline, its stories survived. Babylon teaches that civilizations endure not only through buildings and armies, but through ideas that travel across time. Its myths still speak because they address timeless fears, chaos, power, and the fragility of order. Unlike some ancient civilizations where rulers were worshipped as gods, Babylon followed a different model of kingship. The Babylonian king was not divine. He was human, flawed, and accountable. His authority came from the gods, especially Marduk, but it was conditional. This distinction shaped how power functioned in Babylonian society. The king's primary duty was to maintain order. This meant enforcing law, protecting the city, supporting temples, and ensuring prosperity. Victory in war, successful harvests, and social stability were signs that the gods approved of his rule. Failure suggested divine displeasure. Royal inscriptions emphasize humility before the gods. Kings described themselves as chosen servants, shepherds of the people, or restorers of justice. This language was not modesty. It was political theology. By presenting themselves as servants of divine will, kings legitimized their authority while limiting its scope. Ritual reinforced this balance. During the New Year festival, the king was publicly humiliated before Marduk's statue. He was stripped of royal symbols and struck by a priest. Only after confessing faults was his authority restored. This ritual symbolized a powerful idea. No king ruled absolutely. This system restrained tyranny, but created vulnerability. A king who lost divine favor lost legitimacy. Rivals could claim the gods supported them instead. Political instability often followed perceived religious failure. Babylonian kingship was therefore fragile by design. It depended on performance, perception, and ritual. Power was earned repeatedly, not assumed permanently. Kingship alone could not govern Babylon. Authority required administration. Beneath the king existed a complex bureaucracy that managed law, taxation, labor, religion, and communication. This system allowed Babylon to function as a large, organized state. Officials included governors, judges, tax collectors, military commanders, and temple administrators. Many came from elite families trained in scribal schools. Their power derived from expertise rather than birth alone. Literacy mattered. Bureaucracy brought stability. Written records tracked resources, obligations, and decisions. Archives préservaient précédents. This reduced chaos and limited arbitrary rule. However, bureaucracy also created distance between ruler and people. Corruption existait. Officials abused power. When central authority weakened, local elites acted independently. The king relied on loyalty and oversight. Rewards and punishments maintained order. Yet this balance was delicate. Too much control bred resentment. Too little invited rebellion. Babylon's bureaucratic state was advanced for its time. It allowed empire building and long-term governance, but also made the system rigid. Adaptation was slow. When crises emerged, bureaucracy could not replace strong leadership. This limitation became clear during Babylon's decline. Babylon's conception of power carried inherent risk. Because authority depended on divine approval, failure undermined legitimacy quickly. Military defeat, famine, or disaster could trigger loss of confidence. Rivals exploited this weakness. Rebels claimed the gods favored them. Foreign conquerors presented themselves as chosen by Babylon's gods, as Cyrus famously did. This strategy worked because Babylonian ideology allowed it. Power in Babylon was symbolic as much as physical. Temples, rituals, and inscriptions mattered. When symbols lost credibility, power eroded. This explains why Babylon sometimes fell without massive resistance. People believed the gods had already decided the outcome. Babylon's strength and weakness came from the same source. Its commitment to law, order, and divine authority created stability, but also fragility. The city ruled the world by convincing it that order mattered. When belief faded, walls meant little. In Babylonian civilization, the family was the core social unit. The state, economy, and religious life were all built upon family organization. Households were usually extended, including parents, children, grandparents, and sometimes enslaved individuals or dependents. Authority within the household rested primarily with the male head, but this authority came with responsibilities defined by law and custom. Marriage was not merely a personal relationship. It was a legal and economic contract. Families negotiated marriages carefully, considering property, alliances, and social standing. Dowries were central to these arrangements. A woman brought property into the marriage, which remained legally hers, even though it was managed by her husband during the marriage. Children were expected to contribute to the household from an early age. Sons were trained in their father's trade or sent to scribal schools if the family could afford it. Daughters learned household management, textile production, and religious duties. Family loyalty was paramount. Abandoning parents or failing to support them in old age was both a moral and legal offense. Divorce was permitted but regulated. Men could initiate divorce more easily, but women had legal protections. If a husband dismissed his wife without cause, he was often required to compensate her financially. These laws reflect a society that valued order over emotion, stability over personal freedom. Family life was shaped by uncertainty. Disease, war, and famine were constant threats. Strong family bonds provided resilience. In this sense, the Babylonian family was not just a private institution. It was a survival strategy. Women in Babylonian society occupied a complex position. They lived in a patriarchal system, but they were not without rights. Babylonian law recognized women as legal persons. They could own property, inherit wealth, conduct business, and appear in court. Elite women, especially priestesses and royal family members, held significant influence. Some priestesses managed temple estates, supervised workers, and controlled large economic resources. Their status was protected by law and ritual. Ordinary women participated actively in the economy. Many worked in textile production, brewing, and trade. Women ran taverns, managed shops, and lent money. Economic independence was possible, though limited by social expectations. Marriage restricted some freedoms, but did not erase legal identity. A married woman's dowry remained hers. If widowed, she retained control over her property and children's inheritance until they came of age. However, inequality was real. Adultery laws were harsher for women. Social reputation mattered deeply. A woman accused of immoral behavior faced severe punishment, sometimes without strong evidence. Babylonian society balanced pragmatism with control. Women were valuable contributors to economic life, but their sexuality and behavior were tightly regulated. This tension reflects a broader concern with order and lineage. Women were not invisible in Babylon. They were present in records, contracts, and disputes. Their lives mattered enough to be regulated in detail. Gender roles in Babylon were reinforced through religion and tradition. Gods and goddesses embodied different aspects of life. Female deities represented fertility, love, war, and wisdom. This divine presence gave symbolic importance to women's roles, even if real power remained unequal. Ritual life included women at many levels. Women served as priestesses, musicians, and participants in festivals. Religious devotion provided one of the few socially accepted public roles for women outside the household. Motherhood was highly valued. Bearing children ensured family continuity and economic security. Infertility was often blamed on women, leading to social pressure and sometimes divorce. Adoption was practiced to address childlessness, showing a practical approach to family continuity. Gender expectations shaped behavior from childhood. Boys were prepared for public roles. Girls were prepared for domestic and religious responsibilities. These roles were not always rigid, but deviation carried risk. Despite constraints, Babylonian women navigated their world with agency. Legal records show women asserting rights, defending property, and negotiating contracts. Their voices survive in clay tablets, quiet but persistent. Babylonian society was hierarchical and unequal, but not simplistic. Gender roles were shaped by law, economy, religion, and survival needs. Women were neither fully oppressed nor fully equal. They were essential. Understanding Babylon requires understanding its women, because they sustained families, preserved culture, and endured every rise and fall alongside the city itself. Babylonian society was deeply hierarchical. Social order was not accidental. It was structured, reinforced by law, religion, and economic practice. At the top stood the king and royal family, followed by priests, high officials, and wealthy landowners. Beneath them were free citizens, artisans, merchants, farmers, and finally slaves. Each class had defined rights, duties, and expectations. This hierarchy was reflected clearly in Babylonian law. Punishments varied depending on social status. An injury inflicted on a noble carried harsher consequences than the same injury inflicted on a commoner or slave. Justice was not equal, but it was predictable. Everyone knew where they stood. Free citizens formed the backbone of society. They could own land, engage in trade, marry freely, and appeal to courts. Their obligations included taxes, labor service, and military duty. Economic success could improve one's position, but social mobility was limited. Birth mattered. Priests and temple officials occupied a unique space. Their authority was religious, economic, and administrative. Temples controlled land, labor, and wealth. This gave priests influence that sometimes rivaled royal power. Hierarchy created stability, but also tension. When elites abused their position or failed to protect lower classes, resentment grew. Babylon's social structure depended on balance. When balance failed, unrest followed. Hierarchy was not seen as injustice. It was seen as natural order, reflecting the structure of the cosmos itself. Slavery existed in Babylon, but it differed from later racialized systems. Babylonian slavery was often temporary and economic rather than permanent and hereditary. Many slaves were debtors who had lost freedom due to unpaid loans. Others were prisoners of war or individuals sold by families during hardship. Slaves were considered property, but they were also legal persons. They could marry, own property, conduct business, and in some cases purchase their freedom. Abuse of slaves was regulated. Killing a slave carried penalties. Debt slavery was especially common. Laws limited its duration, often to 3 years. This reflects concern about social collapse if too many citizens lost freedom permanently. Temple slaves held unique status. Some served gods and lived relatively secure lives. Others performed hard labor. Conditions varied widely. Slavery was woven into the economy. Large projects depended on slave labor. Households relied on slaves for domestic work. Yet slavery was not the foundation of production. Free labor remained dominant. Babylonian slavery reveals a society struggling to balance economic necessity with social cohesion. Totale exploitation risqued instability. Class differences shaped everyday experience. Wealth determined access to education, legal advantage, and security. Poor families lived close to survival. A single bad harvest could mean debt or servitude. The state attempted to manage class tension through law and ritual. Debt forgiveness, legal protections, and religious ideology reinforced order. Kings portrayed themselves as protectors of the weak, even when reality fell short. When leadership failed, class tension intensified. Rebellions often began among those most burdened by taxes and labor demands. Elites sometimes sided with invaders if it preserved their status. Social hierarchy helped Babylon endure for centuries, but it also limited adaptability. Rigid systems resisted change. When external pressures increased, internal divisions weakened resistance. Babylon's social order created greatness and vulnerability at the same time. It organized society effectively, but demanded constant maintenance. Understanding Babylon means understanding how inequality was accepted, managed, and sometimes resisted. The city's rise and fall cannot be separated from its social structure. For the Babylonians, health was never purely physical. The human body was understood as existing within a web of divine forces, cosmic order, and unseen dangers. Illness was rarely seen as random. Disease was interpreted as a sign that something had gone wrong in the relationship between humans and the gods, spirits, or demons. Babylonians believed that many illnesses were caused by supernatural agents. Angry gods, restless spirits of the dead, or malevolent demons were thought to attack the body. Because of this belief, diagnosing illness required more than observing symptoms. It required interpretation. Why had the illness occurred? Which god was offended? What ritual had been neglected? This worldview did not mean Babylonians ignored physical reality. They observed symptoms carefully. Pain, swelling, fever, paralysis, and mental distress were described in detailed medical texts. But observation existed alongside belief. A headache might be treated with herbs, but also with prayers. A seizure might be addressed through ritual cleansing as well as physical care. The body itself was seen as vulnerable and temporary. Humans were created to serve the gods, not to be immortal. Suffering was expected, but not meaningless. Illness had a cause and therefore a possible remedy, if the correct divine and practical steps were taken. Fear played a strong role. Sudden illness could be terrifying, especially when explanations were uncertain. Communities relied on specialists to mediate between the physical and spiritual worlds. Medicine in Babylon was as much about restoring balance as curing disease. This integrated view of body and belief shaped Babylonian medicine for centuries. Babylonian medicine was practiced by different types of specialists, each with distinct roles. Two of the most important were the physician, who focused on physical treatment, and the exorcist, who addressed supernatural causes. These roles often overlapped, but they represented different approaches to healing. Physicians used practical methods. They applied ointments, poultices, bandages, and herbal remedies. Medical texts list ingredients such as plants, minerals, oils, and animal products. Instructions were precise, suggesting experience and experimentation over time. Exorcists focused on ritual. They recited incantations, performed purification ceremonies, and invoked gods to drive away harmful spirits. These rituals followed strict formulas passed down through training. Correct words mattered as much as correct actions. Diagnosis involved divination. The healer might observe symptoms, consult omens, or interpret dreams. The goal was to understand the source of illness. Treatment followed accordingly. Medical responsibility was taken seriously. Hammurabi's code includes laws governing medical practice. If a physician caused harm, punishment could be severe. This suggests that medical outcomes were valued and regulated. Training was rigorous. Medical knowledge was preserved in tablets copied across generations. Apprentices learned through observation and repetition. Medicine was not improvised. It was a disciplined field. Babylonian medicine may appear unscientific by modern standards, but within its worldview, it was systematic, careful, and sincere. It sought healing, not explanation alone. Babylonian cities faced serious health challenges. Crowded living conditions, limited sanitation, and reliance on river water increased the spread of disease. Epidemics could devastate populations. Medical knowledge helped, but it had limits. Public health was not organized as a separate system, but it existed indirectly. Laws regulated waste disposal, water use, and building safety. These measures reduced risk, even if their purpose was not fully understood. Nutrition played a role. Diets based on grain provided energy, but lacked variety. Malnutrition weakened resistance to illness. The poor suffered most. Mental health was also recognized, though explained differently. Anxiety, despair, and madness were attributed to divine punishment or spirit possession. Ritual comfort was often as important as treatment. Despite limitations, Babylonian medicine reflects compassion. People sought to relieve suffering, to understand illness, and to restore balance. Healing was communal. Family, priests, and healers all participated. Medicine did not prevent Babylon's decline, but it supported survival. It allowed individuals to endure hardship and maintain life in a difficult environment. Babylon's medical tradition reminds us that caring for the body has always been tied to caring for meaning. For the Babylonians, time was not abstract. It was sacred, structured, and deeply connected to the will of the gods. Time governed agriculture, ritual, law, and political authority. To control time was to participate in cosmic order. Babylonians believed the universe operated according to patterns established by the gods. These patterns could be observed in the movement of the sun, moon, and stars. Time was cyclical rather than linear. Seasons returned. Festivals repeated. History echoed itself. This belief shaped how Babylonians understood both progress and decline. The gods were thought to reveal their intentions through time. Auspicious days brought success. Inauspicious days brought disaster. Choosing the right moment for action mattered greatly. Kings delayed campaigns, priests postponed rituals, and merchants avoided contracts based on calendrical signs. Timekeeping was therefore an act of interpretation. Priests and scholars studied celestial movements to determine proper timing. Errors were dangerous. Performing a ritual on the wrong day could anger the gods and disrupt order. Human responsibility lay in alignment. People could not control time, but they could obey it. Respecting cycles meant respecting the gods. Ignoring them invited chaos. This worldview gave time moral weight. Past actions mattered. Future consequences followed patterns. Babylonian culture did not believe in endless progress. It believed in balance. Understanding time meant understanding one's place in the universe. Babylon built its civilization around that understanding. Babylonian calendars were among the most sophisticated of the ancient world. They were lunar calendars based on the cycles of the moon, adjusted periodically to align with the solar year. This required careful observation and calculation. Each month began with the sighting of the new moon. Priests reported observations to authorities. If clouds obscured the sky, uncertainty followed. These moments were feared because inaccurate calendars disrupted ritual and administration. Calendars regulated everything. Agricultural schedules depended on them. Religious festivals followed strict dates. Legal deadlines, tax collection, and labor obligations were all time-bound. Without a reliable calendar, society could not function smoothly. Astronomy supported this system. Babylonian scholars recorded planetary movements for centuries. They identified repeating cycles and developed predictive methods. Their work was not speculative. It was practical. Accurate prediction meant control. Timekeeping reinforced authority. Those who controlled the calendar controlled ritual legitimacy. Kings relied on priestly expertise. Priests relied on royal patronage. This mutual dependence stabilized power. Calendars also recorded history. Important events were dated. Reigns were measured in years. Time became a record, not just an experience. Through calendars, Babylon turned the sky into a tool of governance. Few civilizations understood time so deeply or used it so effectively. Babylonians did not write history as modern historians do, but they were deeply aware of the past. They recorded events, reigns, omens, and disasters. These records formed a collective memory that shaped decisions. Past failures warned of divine anger. Past successes inspired imitation. Kings restored ancient temples to claim continuity. Innovation was framed as restoration. The past legitimized the present. Time also brought anxiety. Babylonian texts express fear of decline. They recognized that civilizations rise and fall. This awareness made Babylon cautious but also fatalistic. When Babylon fell to Persia, many believed it was part of a larger cycle. The gods had shifted favor. Time had turned. This acceptance did not erase loss, but it explained it. Babylon survived in memory because it understood impermanence. Babylonian control of time was never absolute, but their respect for it shaped one of the most enduring civilizations in history. They did not conquer time. They listened to it. Babylon did not end with fire and sudden destruction. Its decline was slow, uneven, and almost quiet. After centuries of conquest, foreign rule, and shifting political centers, the city gradually lost the very conditions that had once sustained it. This makes Babylon's end especially important. It was not destroyed in a single moment. It was left behind. Under Persian, then Hellenistic rule, Babylon remained inhabited, but its population slowly shrank. Administrative functions moved to newer cities founded by Alexander's successors. Trade routes shifted. Political decisions were made elsewhere. Babylon's economic and symbolic importance faded year by year. The irrigation systems that had once sustained its agriculture required constant maintenance. As labor declined and state investment weakened, canals silted up, fields became less productive. Farming communities moved away. Food shortages followed, reinforcing decline. Temples that once dominated religious life lost funding and influence. Priests struggled to maintain rituals. Sacred spaces fell into disrepair. When rituals stopped, Babylonians believed divine protection weakened. This belief accelerated abandonment. Environmental change also played a role. Shifts in river courses altered water access. Flooding damaged structures. Without strong governance, repairs lagged. By the first centuries of the Common Era, Babylon was no longer a city in the full sense. It was a cluster of settlements amid ruins. Its walls stood, but few lived within them. Memory remained stronger than presence. Babylon did not fall. It faded. As Babylon declined physically, it grew in imagination. Travelers, historians, and writers encountered ruins and attempted to understand them. What they found inspired awe and speculation. Greek and Roman authors described Babylon with fascination, often exaggerating its scale and wealth. They relied on earlier accounts and imagination more than observation. The real city no longer matched its reputation. Over time, Babylon became less a place and more a symbol. Its ruins were interpreted as warnings. Greatness leads to arrogance. Arrogance invites downfall. Local populations reused Babylon's bricks for new settlements. Temples were dismantled. Statues disappeared. The city became a quarry. This practical reuse erased physical traces, even as stories multiplied. By the medieval period, Babylon existed almost entirely in texts. Its location was uncertain. Its history blurred with myth. Ironically, the disappearance of Babylon's physical form preserved its symbolic power. Ruins allowed imagination to fill gaps. Babylon became timeless. This transformation from city to legend ensured Babylon's survival in human thought long after its streets emptied. Babylon's disappearance marked more than the end of a city. It marked the close of an entire ancient world. Mesopotamian civilization, which had shaped law, writing, science, and empire, gave way to new centers of power. The systems Babylon pioneered were absorbed elsewhere. Law evolved, writing changed, science advanced, but the integrated worldview that defined Mesopotamia faded. Babylon's decline reminds us that civilizations are ecosystems. They depend on environment, belief, administration, and memory. When enough elements fail, even the greatest cities vanish. Yet Babylon's end was not meaningless. Its legacy survived in others. Greek scholars built on Babylonian astronomy. Biblical traditions carried its memory. Modern law echoes its structure. Babylon ended, but it did not fail. It completed its historical role. The ancient world moved on, carrying Babylon within it. To understand Babylon properly, it must be seen not simply as a city or empire, but as a complete civilization. Babylon shaped how humans organized power, law, knowledge, belief, and daily life. Long before modern states existed, Babylon answered questions that every civilization must confront. Who has authority? How justice should work? How humans relate to the universe? How order can be preserved in a fragile world? Babylon did not invent these questions, but it institutionalized the answers. Law became written and public. Knowledge became archived. Time became measured and regulated. Religion became structured into ritual cycles that connected humans to cosmic order. These systems allowed Babylon to survive invasions, regime changes, and centuries of instability. The rise of Babylon was not accidental. It emerged because its systems worked. Hammurabi's laws created predictability. Religious rituals created legitimacy. Administration created continuity. Trade created wealth. Education created memory. Each element reinforced the others. At its height, under Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon represented the ideal ancient city. It was fortified, wealthy, learned, and symbolically powerful. Visitors were overwhelmed not just by walls and temples, but by the sense that Babylon stood at the center of the world. But completeness can become rigidity. Systems that ensure survival can also resist adaptation. Babylon trusted continuity over innovation. It looked backward for legitimacy. When the world around it changed, Babylon responded slowly. This tension between stability and flexibility defines Babylon's story. It rose because it created order. It fell because that order could not adjust indefinitely. Babylon shows that civilization is not just growth. It is balance. It is easy to say Babylon fell because it was conquered. That explanation is incomplete. Babylon was conquered many times and survived. Its final decline occurred not because of a single enemy, but because internal and external pressures aligned over centuries. Internally, Babylon suffered from exhaustion. Continuous warfare, heavy taxation, social inequality, and elite rivalry weakened cohesion. Faith in leadership declined. Religious confidence fractured. People no longer believed the city was divinely protected. Externally, power shifted. New empires emerged with different governing philosophies. Persia ruled through integration rather than domination. Later empires founded new cities better suited to evolving trade and military needs. Babylon's geographic advantages diminished. Environmental strain also mattered. Irrigation systems failed. River paths shifted. Agriculture déclined. Without constant maintenance, the land itself resisted civilization. Most importantly, Babylon lost its centrality. Power no longer required Babylon symbols. Law, science, and administration could exist elsewhere. Once Babylon stopped being necessary, it stopped being supported. Civilizations do not die when they lose battles. They die when they lose purpose. Babylon's fall teaches that endurance depends not only on strength, but relevance. Babylon's story continues to matter because it reflects patterns that repeat throughout history. Rise through organization, prosperity through systems, decline through rigidity, memory through myth. Babylon teaches that law can restrain power, but not replace wisdom. That knowledge can preserve civilization, but not protect it alone. That belief unites societies, but can also undermine them when faith collapses. Modern societies still live with Babylonian ideas. Written law, bureaucracy, timekeeping, education, archive. These systems shape the world today. Babylon lives on through them. At the same time, Babylon warns against believing any system is permanent. Walls fall, rivers move, power shifts. What matters is the ability to adapt without losing identity. Babylon's greatest achievement was not conquest. It was continuity. Its greatest failure was believing continuity guaranteed survival. The rise and fall of Babylon is not ancient history alone. It is human history, and that is why Babylon will never truly disappear. You have just traveled through thousands of years of human history. You saw how Babylon rose from mud brick villages into the heart of civilization. How laws replaced revenge. How writing preserved memory. How religion united people under shared belief. And how power, when it grows too rigid, begins to collapse from within. Babylon teaches us that civilizations are not destroyed only by enemies. They fall when they stop adapting. When systems meant to create order become tools of control. When belief turns into certainty. When leaders forget that power must be renewed, not assumed. Babylon was brilliant. Babylon was organized. Babylon was confident. And Babylon still fell. But it did not disappear without meaning. Its ideas live on in our laws, our calendars, our cities, and our understanding of history itself. Babylon reminds us that human achievement is fragile, but also extraordinary. Every society stands on the ruins of those before it. If you enjoyed this journey through ancient history, this is just the beginning. More stories of lost empires, forgotten kings, and hidden truths are waiting for you here on History Teller YT. Stay curious, stay questioning, and come back again because history never truly ends.